we couldn't have a better time to run this event, but we have had some revisions in our presenters, and Minister Shorten is not able to be here today. His office advised us late Friday afternoon that he wasn't able to attend. We do have a morning tea break during the event, which will be served here, and lunch at the end of the event at 1 o'clock. So please feel free to be there for that. The bathroom facilities are down the lift, level 1. They're down 1 level and down underneath here, for those who need to know. We also need to acknowledge that this event is being recorded. We do have one representative of the media in the room, so please be mindful of that when you are sharing whatever. If you do want to say something and then later think you would like to have it deleted from the recording, please let us know before we make that a meeting publicly available. So with that in mind, I will just hand over to Professor Julian Thomas. Welcome, Julian, and welcome to the audience, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you very much for all the work that you've done in bringing us together today. We want to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we're meeting today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I hope you can hear me okay. We extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today, and to their ancestors and elders past and present. We also acknowledge the custodians, the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands across Australia where we work and live. Now, this event has been organised by our research centre, the Centre for Automated Decision Making in Society. We'll get into it very quickly, but we thought it'd be useful just to say a little bit about what motivates us to organise this. Our centre commenced in 2020. It's a national multidisciplinary research centre focused on building the knowledge base and informing the strategies that are going to be necessary to support the development of responsible, ethical and inclusive automated decision making. So it's about what do we need to know in order to do that, and what strategies are going to be required to make that happen. So we started thinking about this centre in, well, goes back a fair way, but when we were working on it, 2017, 2018, of course, Robodebt was prominent in our minds as a central example of government failure in this space, and we were convinced that there was a great deal that we could learn from what was happening, what we could see was happening around us at the time. Now, since then, many of the people who are involved in this event, and of course many others, have brought Robodebt sharply into focus. We have a much better understanding of it right now. We know that Robodebt was systematically unlawful. We know that many of the then existing review and oversight mechanisms failed to stop it. We know that hundreds of thousands of people were appallingly damaged, hurt, traumatised and worse by the experience of Robodebt. And we also knew, as we were thinking about the kind of work that our centre was going to have to do, that Robodebt was in fact a very crude exercise in automated decision making. The underlying technologies weren't complex, but we knew that future systems were likely to be far more complex, more opaque, and far more inscrutable. So we're now away further along. In the last week, of course, we've also seen the release, the very welcome release of the Royal Commission's report, which gives us a detailed account of what happened. The findings and recommendations of that report are going to, of course, demand time for consideration, reflection and action. So while the Royal Commission report I'm sure is going to inform and be some of the subject of what we're talking about today, it's not the focus of today. The focus of today is really on what are the lessons from Robodebt. What we're doing is providing multiple perspectives on that experience. We recognise that many different people from many different kinds of organisations, from many different parts of civil society, government, the professions, academia and elsewhere have played a significant role in the Robodebt story and indeed in ending Robodebt. So we're going to be hearing from a number of those people, and the panels are intended to be interactive discussions which can generate conversation between people on the panel and with us all here today. So we welcome all those different perspectives. We know that Robodebt has been exceptionally harmful and traumatic, and that it's generated a great deal, of course, of passionate argument, while the conversation, we're sure, is going to be robust at times. We're asking everybody to be respectful. Our focus throughout is on what Robodebt and the experience of Robodebt, the experience of responding to Robodebt can teach us. And by the us, I'm thinking certainly not just of academics or researchers, but also, of course, civil society organisations, activists, advocates, social policy and media practitioners, lawyers and public servants. What can we learn from each other and from the experience, from the evidence that we now have about how we can make sure that we avoid these kinds of catastrophes in future? We know that automation is accelerating. We know that more and more critical government services have moved online, and that has especially been the case during and since the pandemic. And we know that many or most of these services could be far better than they are. So our mantra in the centre of responsible, ethical and inclusive automated decision making, for us, isn't a nice to have, it's a must have. The question is how do we get there? So that's what motivates us in the centre, and of course we're really looking forward to hearing from everybody here, online and in the room about what the next steps can be. Paul, I'm going to pass it back to you if that's okay. Thank you.
So the plan today is we'll have the first roundtable on civil society and the media. We'll have a break for morning tea, and then our second roundtable, which will be focusing on the legal profession and public service. And then we'll close with drawing the lessons together from the overall discussion of the day. The intent of this event is that we'll have some panellists to give insights from their own work and their own professional experience. And then we will have an opportunity to engage with those panellists. So I invite our two in-person panellists up to today, and we have two online panellists. As you, Monica and Sarah, would you like to come up? And I'm told we've got Asha and Cassandra online as well. So let me introduce, you want to just take us wherever you like. So Asha Wolf is a freelance journalist and community worker. Asha was involved in a leading organiser in the Robodebt campaign, and their Twitter profile and hashtag #NotMyDebt was well recognised through Asha's contribution. They were a co-founder of the decentralised worldwide cryptography crypto party movement promoting the use of cryptography for privacy and security. In 2014, they were recipient of the Amnesty Australia Media Award. Asha is currently working in the community service sector while completing a Masters of Social Work. Dr. Cassandra Goldie, who is the CEO of ACOSS. Cassandra has been working in the area of economic and social issues, civil societies, social justice and human rights for the last several decades. She has represented the interests of people who are disadvantaged in civil society in major national and international processes, as well as in grassroots communities, including previously as the Director of Sex and Age Discrimination in the Australian Human Rights Commission. So welcome, Cassandra. Sarah Thatcher is the Law Reform Officer in Economic Justice Australia. Economic Justice Australia is the peak body for the Welfare Rights Network, and Sarah is currently undertaking a research project as part of the Economic Justice Australia to understand better the ways in which automation impacts on social security clients and legal representation. And lastly, we have Professor Monica Attard. Monica is a professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, and prior to that spent 28 years working at the ABC, working across radio, television and television. She is best known for hosting some of the ABC's flagship programs, including PM, The World Today and Media Watch, and being a reporter and foreign correspondent for AM, a journalist of 35 years. She has also been a TV and radio reporter, including for Four Corners and Lateline, a foreign correspondent, and was the foundation editor of the website The Global Mail. So can please join me in welcoming all our four panellists. So I'm going to ask each panellist to kind of question, reflecting on Robodebt to start off with. And after that, I'll be asking a question of each of our panellists to say, well, what does this mean? What are the lessons that we take forward to learning about how we can make, ensure that government future use of automation and AI, artificial intelligence, is inclusive, accountable, and fair. So I want to begin starting with Asha. Welcome, Cassandra, and welcome, Asha. We can now see you on our screens. So Asha, you describe yourself as a campaign organiser and journalist. In many people's minds, you were the public voice of Robodebt and Not My Debt on Twitter. Can you please share with us how you came to be aware of what we now know as Robodebt and how you sought to build an activist network in giving public visibility to Robodebt?
Okay, beautiful. I think the first thing I want to explain is that there's no Aaron Brockoviches in the Robodebt campaign. There were many, many, many people who contributed to bring the scheme to this point, starting from whistleblowers, the recipients of Robodebts, the activists, so Lindsay Jackson, Amy Patterson, Justin Warren, and many NGOs, ACOSS, CPSU, Get Up, Vic Legal Aid, the lawyers, so Terry Carney, all of these people and the politicians who put pressure for there to be a class action and royal commission. They were all part of this ecosystem that brought the campaign to life. And my role was really to be a circus ringleader. It was unpaid, I took it on myself. And the reason that I became involved was two things. The first off is that I have dyscalculia. So numbers don't make sense to me. I get very confused by most things involving money and dates and times. And the second thing is that I have huge anxiety over anything involving Centrelink or the government. And so Robodebt was really the merger point of those two issues, money and the government. So a few years before Robodebt became part of the public consciousness, I received a Centrelink debt for family tax benefit. I hadn't lodged my tax returns that year because I hadn't had much income. We'd had a death in the family, and I got a demand notice for about $8,000. And I was living in this little apartment as a sole parent, and I basically had a meltdown on the phone to a Centrelink agent, and we got to the bottom of it. I did my tax return, and I found out I didn't owe the government anything. I got some tax back, and then I found out my mum had also had a family tax benefit debt just after leaving my dad. And so I was pretty enraged by all of this. And in August 2016, a whistleblower came to me and said, Asha, have you seen this Commonwealth Government Gazette about the non-employment data matching scheme? And I said, what? Because I had no idea what that was. And I wasn't on JobSeeker or any Centrelink payments like that, apart from family tax benefits. So I didn't really understand what they were talking about. But again, the media began to talk about it. So Sally White at Crikey, Peter Martin at the Sydney Morning Herald, and then later Nous at Guardian. And there was an understanding that the government had fundamentally changed something about the way in which data matching was occurring, and that this had been automated in a way that was leading to faulty outcomes. So basically, at this point, a group of us came together on Twitter. I had quite a large Twitter following, and we began to talk about ways that we could create a feedback loop to create public pressure against Robodebt. So Ben Eltham coined the term Robodebt, and Lindsay Jackson built the Not My Debt website, which we used to platform the stories of people that had received debts. Basically, my role was to spend about 12 hours a day online, scanning these stories, pushing them on Twitter, building up public emotion around Robodebt, and then feeding those stories towards media, feeding whistleblowers towards friendly media, so media that continued to use terms like dole bludger. I would quietly signal to my masses on Twitter to make life very unpleasant online for them. And so it was also a process of trying to change public sentiment that was driven by media around welfare recipients. So we had a loop going of feeding people back from Twitter towards Not My Debt for help. And so one of the most prolific activists does not wish to be named, and they're involved in looking at how people receive debts and how they could fight debts and giving them advice directly. And they were with Not My Debt. And in the background, I built a Slack room, a private Slack room of around 200 people involved in the process of fighting Robodebt. So journalists, academics, lawyers, unionists, hackers, graphic artists, and content scrapers, economists. And in another room, we sent the general public, because there was 433,000 people affected by Robodebt. And we couldn't orchestrate all the masses at once, but we could try and work together as a network campaign. Really, it started with whistleblowers, and from then it was driven by activists and media and people willing to stand up before the AAT, Dina Armato, and Madeline Masterson. You know, there was acts of bravery and courage throughout the campaign, and it was never, ever one person, it was thousands. So I think that's what I want to say.
I'm wanting to hand over now to Cassandra Goldie. Cassandra, you're the CEO of the ACOSS, and it's a national peak body for the social service organisations in Australia. Over the years, ACOSS has been quite vocal in its representation, public representation about Robodebt. Can you explain how ACOSS came to be first aware of Robodebt, and why was it seen as an area to campaign on? And can you tell us about the strategies that ACOSS uses to try to get change in things like Robodebt?
Yeah. I think, have I got feedback now? Is that all right, everybody? Yeah. Just acknowledging I'm on Noongar country, actually. I'm over in the West today, and Asha is one person. Can I just say, it's just extraordinary everything. I saw you everywhere. It was phenomenal. And just to actually be able to sit on the screen next to you today, I feel quite emotional about it, actually. So I do. There you go. Because I know, extraordinary. And and I reiterate all that you said about, this is not one of those moments where somebody, steps forward and says, thank you very much. It was just, every layer, NGOs, grassroots, extraordinary digital, systems, so strongly focused on helping people as well, because this was not a campaign, this was a humanitarian crisis, actually. The scale of it and the way that it was unleashed on people and the timing of it, and the Royal Commission lays all that out in it's all, I'm sure for many people, I said it when the report came out on Friday, it's a hard day, because it's a hard day to see it all again and to just see that from the absolute first moment that we got any wind of what ended up being, shown in all its horrific detail as morally, ethically, and then, legally wrong, we knew that this was going to be a crisis that would hit people. So the very first time that we identified what we didn't quite know what it was, but we could see that it was big and it was going to be ugly, was it was not long after the May budget in 2016, and the then ministers came out with this sort of media pitch story about the big dollars. I think it was 1.7 billion that they were going to do through a welfare crackdown. Welfare integrity, all the usual euphemisms, Sasha, that, are actually really about taking money out of the hands of people who don't have enough already. And we issued a very clear media release then. We didn't know how we thought they cannot do this in any shape or form that would be anything other than a travesty. And of course, it was off the back of, ongoing relentless policies were targeting people who are relying on income support. Of course, there was the Abbott horror budget that, was proposing to cut youth allowance for 6 months, every 6 months, for example, and to cut the energy supplement and to cut the pension education supplement. And so our media release on that day said this. It's about the announcement of the coalition's costings and further, in quotes, crackdowns on welfare payments. We would outline our concerns that the proposals to take further funds out of the welfare system while doing nothing to ensure income adequacy for people living on the lowest incomes would lead to significant hardship for vulnerable people affected if it results in more automation or aggressive debt recovery approaches. We picked then that it could only involve those kinds of things. So that's what we predicted was coming out the door. And we strongly oppose taking any more money out of income support payments. This is the last place the coalition should be looking for savings to fund new election spending promises. It was really clear what it was about then. People are struggling to survive on, JobSeeker there, Nash, was $38, per day. New Start payments, it was called then, which has not been increased in 2 decades. So that was the June of 2016. And then, of course, as Asha described, towards the end of that year, as the system was rolled out on a grand scale, of course, we were surrounded by alarm. And so very quickly in the December, we wrote to, it was the Minister Tudge that we wrote to, and then by the early January, we'd laid out a further letter that set out exactly all of the issues that were repeated by all of you people involved in this repeatedly over and over again. The automation, the reversing of the onus of proof, the income averaging, all of which were wrong. So I think my reflection, and I said it in the, when we gave our evidence before the Royal Commission, was absolutely we need the individuals, the ministers, the public servants, anybody who can be found to have breached their obligations should be held to account. And we'll see what flows from this, and all of it should flow. But I do want us to see this as another moment to understand and to absolutely stop the culture that allowed this to be rolled out, not only to be rolled out in the way that it was rolled out, but for it to continue in the face of all of the advocacy, all of the legal advice, all of the, repeated alarm. Nobody could say that the government did not know about what was being done to people. And I reflected, I thought it probably wouldn't be done to the mining industry. We know that this was about a culture that where the feedback loop, and the evidence was given in the commission, the feedback loop to the ministers of the day was, this is playing well in marginal electorates. The reality is that we have a country, we're a very wealthy country, and yet we have this culture which sees that it is politically beneficial to be seen to be getting tough on people who rely on income support. And even now we have, language that speaks to working families. Well, who does that exclude? Why do we talk about working families as the shorthand phrase of talking about the electorate, right? It lays out this sort of who's more deserving and who's not. The lefters and leaners, as we said, and the Commissioner highlighted the sort of taxpayers on the one hand and the welfare recipients. And anybody will remember Duncan Storer, on Q&A said, hang on a minute, I pay tax too. I happen to be relying on income support, but I am both and all, and I'm a human being. And so there are, as many people I'm sure we'll discuss today, we know that within this system, there are many practices and policies and laws that still perpetrate terrible distress on people and take money from people that should not be taken from them, for example, where people are not getting an adequate income. We know the unemployment payment is still the lowest in the OECD, despite us being a wealthy country, and everybody has been calling that out for at least 2 decades. And we got, what was it, $20 in the last federal budget, at the same time as for people on very high incomes, on to over $200,000 per week, they will be getting, through those stage 3 tax cuts, $173 per week in extra cash. That is where we are. So I really thank everybody for including yourselves, for bringing us together today, in this timing, because I think we need to definitely make sure there's justice for people who are directly affected by Robodebt. But as many of you have said, in a whole lot of different ways, automation is continuing to be rolled out in different shapes and forms. My understanding is that in terms of, for example, payment suspensions, I think we're in the order of about 200,000 payment suspensions per month. I think that was the latest data that was available. And so the important work that human rights-based activists are doing about digitisation and automation is so crucial. So we need to seize this Royal Commission work and use it to take the next major leap forward in saying, we want to see the back of this culture. We want to, there was something really powerful, Asher, about how many people spoke up. And that has continued, I think, the visibility of life on, when you're somebody in a wealthy country living on, a poverty payment, that it is important for us to support people to be visible and to say this needs to change and needs to be done very differently. And I think the Royal Commission work has a lot to offer us to be able to really hold everybody to account for that and to call out as we continue to see the way that the political narrative signals who's deserving and who's not. Well, that needs to stop. I might pause there because I know we're going to have further questions, but and can I say, I was very heartened that the Royal Commission absolutely went to the detail of legality and, the minutiae of government decision-making and, making sure that individuals were identified and those findings were very clear. But she did lead on the first page with this observation about the culture that allowed this to not only be designed, be approved, to continue, and for the government to be re-elected before it was stopped. Thanks.
Cassandra. I wanted to turn to Sarah. Sarah is part of Economic Justice Australia, which is the peak body representing welfare rights legal centres, which provide legal support for people contesting Centrelink decisions. Can you speak to the ways in which the welfare rights centres and EJA in particular came to find out about Robodebt, and What role did EJA have in responding both individually and collectively to the Robodebt story?
How's that? Okay, need to turn it on. So I'll start just by providing a little bit of context about how we work as an organisation. As you say, we're a peak body, and our member centres are community legal centres that have specialist expertise in social security law, and they provide legal assistance to individuals at the very early stages of a legal problem developing. So not just at the AAT and at the federal court, but also internally within Centrelink. They help to run internal reviews. And they also provide all kinds of advice on how to make claims and help navigate people through the claim process. And because of this level of deep engagement with the social security system, they have a particular insight into policies and administrative practices within the social security system, and they can help to identify systemic issues within the system. And in addition to that, they have particular casework guidelines that say that because of capacity issues, essentially, that they are to provide help to people with the most complex legal problems and who are the most vulnerable. So every day they see the kind of stress and trauma that's inflicted on people, usually directly as a result of the system itself. And, you know, as has been said, it was a huge amount of different people that led to the Robodebt issue coming to light. And for us, one of the key challenges as to the difficulties that we face as a sector was the lack of funding and total underfunding, really, of specialist community legal centres who were really on the front lines of a lot of this. Thankfully, Victoria Legal Aid had the skills and the resources to run the test cases that ultimately found Robodebt to be unlawful, but they're actually they're the only legal aid commission that does that kind of social security work, and our community legal centres are the only ones that do that initial advice work. And the beginning of Robodebt actually coincided with a funding cliff for CLCs. So that kind of shows what happens when you weaken civil society. You lose a key part of that voice. And in terms of how we found out about Robodebt, when debt notices started being issued en masse, our community legal centres were immediately facing an influx of people who needed help. They looked through reams of FOI documents for each individual person, trying to figure out how the debt was calculated. They saw all the deliberate barriers that were placed against internal reviews, so like requirements for people to provide evidence before a review was commenced, for example. And so they were aware very early on of what was going on. They were taking people to the tier 1 of the AAT, and they were getting individual debts shot down. So you can imagine how frustrating it would be to see that happening and for the Robodebt scheme to continue on for many years after that. And really, to this day, our member centres are still looking at debts that were issued during that period to determine, with the benefit of hindsight, whether they were actually Robodebts and then using that to get them overturned. And our role as a peak is really just to listen to what our member centres tell us about what their clients are experiencing and convert that into recommendations and advocacy to government. And our submissions and evidence to the Royal Commission is really just a collation of all the work that EJA did over that time period. And I think with the profile that Robodebt now has, there is finally some more recognition about the importance of this kind of work and really what's at stake when things go wrong and there aren't these safeguards in place from civil society. And we're very happy to see amongst the recommendations around funding for community legal centres and legal aid, and also an advocates line to enable our members to have access to Centrelink decision makers in a more direct way instead of having to wait on phone lines for hours and hours. But in terms of the challenge going forward, having the recommendations is one thing, implementation is obviously a whole other story, and our focus will very much be on ensuring that the social security reform recommendations are implemented, including the ones around automation, and that they're ideally built upon. And I think that, as has been said already, the challenge is always going forward, and in the past, is this narrative around social security recipients being undeserving, and Robodebt was an experiment that was conducted on vulnerable people, and it went on for as long as it did because many did not have the kind of political power to be able to push back, and that's what the role of civil society is and why it's so important. But we don't have, I think kind of the missing piece in all this is that we don't have a culture of human rights in Australia, and until we have a rights-focused approach to the system as a whole, we're going to keep facing these kinds of issues until we see social security recipients as rights holders, as having legal entitlements. We're going to struggle, and Royal Commissions in general don't actually have the best track record in terms of resulting in transformative reform that we want to see. And that's partly because it's actually a backwards way of doing law reform, because you have to wait until we've reached total and utter systemic failure and destruction before we start looking at reforming the system. And what we really need is having these preventative mechanisms in place, laws and policies that ensure that human rights and rule of law is at the centre of the way that our systems work. So that's obviously a big challenge, and that's how we see our role as an organisation going forward is pushing to have those recommendations transform into actual systemic change.
Sarah. Monica, as a journalist for many years and now working in the university sector, it gives you an opportunity to be more reflective about the media and its role. At the end of the Robodebt Royal Commissioner Holmes made a point about acknowledging the Guardian's journalist Luke Hendricks Gomez and the Saturday paper journalist Rick Morton, as well as Darren O'Donovan from the university sector, for tweeting about and giving visibility to the Commission and its proceedings, but also noting that the mainstream media didn't really cover much of the proceedings very much. What's your reflection of Australia's media's coverage of Robodebt since 2016, and what's some of the dynamics that we need to that help us understand whether Robodebt is a story or not a story?
Oh, it's working. There it is. Okay. Can I just begin by acknowledging Ash's work? I think she's been particularly humble this morning. She actually did play a massive role in bringing this to the attention of the Australian public, but in particular, the attention of the Australian media. I think without her work and the work of those with whom she was working and the whistleblowers, et cetera, that we wouldn't have been. We would have become aware eventually, but not in the way that we did, not as soon as we did. So I really want to acknowledge the work that she's done there, which I think has been, over the years, in a sustained way, actually phenomenal. And I think it's important to note that really it was social media and not journalism that actually, brought this all to light. But when media did become aware of it, of course, there was some very, very good investigative work that took place, and that by a number of individual journalists at a number of different organisations. So I'm not sure it's fair to say that the media didn't give it visibility, because certainly without even the early investigative work, we wouldn't have known about it. But there was a change in the way it was covered, and that came about because, as we learnt from the Royal Commission, in some very, very cogent evidence brought by Alan Tudger's press secretary, that the government began a rearguard action, which was to fight back against what it saw as kind of hostile media coverage of the issue. And so they took a decision that they would begin to more or less systematically release information about people who had become the victims of robodebt. And that had a pretty chilling effect, because all of a sudden, of course, people didn't want to talk to media about what they were experiencing. And as we know with media, media thrives on the human element. You know, if we haven't got people talking, then we almost don't have a story, or we have no way of illustrating a story. And so that had a really chilling effect, and I think it dried up a lot of the coverage. But also, I think it's remiss not to mention the misuse, the government's at the day's misuse of the journalistic drop, as we call it. That is when a minister or a minister's office drops on a media organisation or a particular journalist a piece of information that they give to them allegedly exclusively, which ensures front page coverage. And, you know, the government had done that in relation to robodebt, and it was very effective. And so in effect, what it then had was it had one media organisation in particular almost acting as its stenographer, and a couple of journalists within that media organisation. So that, I think, stands as a disgraceful episode in Australian journalism, and you would hope that editors would stand up and take note. Although I noted at the time that the editors at the particular paper involved stood by their journalist and said that the journalist was responsible for breaking a number of very, very significant political stories, which may or may not have been the case, but the fact was that the drops to this journalist in relation to this story were particularly distasteful and immoral, really. So, and of course, the way the media was misused in that case represented the nexus of an ideological position taking, because that media organisation shared an ideological position with the government that somehow people who were on welfare were dole bludgers and not worthy of being considered as worthy recipients of taxpayer dollars, and certainly not worthy human beings. So it kind of brought together a number of different interests that was really, really unseemly. In relation to the coverage of the Royal Commission, I mean, I know that there's a lot of criticism that media didn't cover the Royal Commission. I'm actually not sure that's correct. I mean, Twitter is always whinging about how the ABC doesn't cover this and SBS doesn't cover that. And then when you go to their websites and have a look, you actually see there's been an awful lot of coverage. And I think there was a lot of coverage of the Royal Commission. But the problem, of course, is that, you know, it's a secret to absolutely nobody that media has a financial problem. The business models have collapsed. Media is struggling to support itself, and so to deploy somebody to a Royal Commission full-time is a pretty significant commitment and a very expensive one, and a lot of media have to consider how they do that. That's one thing. The second thing I think to mention is that, you know, news media is driven by a set of internal values which are fairly old style, but they rely on stories having certain elements. So conflict is one of them, you know, scandal, things like, you know, proximity, how close the story is to their audience, the threshold, how many people are impacted. And so all of those things are things that news editors and chiefs of staffs in newsroom, when they're considering who to deploy to a story, will sit back and consider, is this story big enough to interest our audience, basically? Now, they're very old style values. I don't think they're particularly relevant in the digital age, and I think we can do better. But for, you know, for better or worse, that's the way news media operates at the moment. And so there was a kind of, you know, a weird wave that went through the way the Royal Commission was covered. So obviously when you had a secretary who was in the firing line, or a secretary who could dob on other secretaries and the processes, or ministers, not to mention Scott Morrison. You know, you get peak interest because that is where media considers a story to be. Now, I'm not saying that that is great public interest journalism, that using those models. In fact, I don't think it is. And it made me, when I was thinking about this, it made me start to think about a comment that was made by your Vice Chancellor here at Sydney University many years ago about the ABC being the broadcaster of market failure. And I thought at the time I was really critical of that, but I actually think he may well be right, that perhaps there is a role for public broadcasters to be in the hot seat all the time, regardless of what the particular news story is on the day. Now, as I said earlier, I think the ABC was there. I think they did cover it. It might not have made the 7 p.m. news every night because only the stories that have all of those news values that I mentioned before will make it to the 7 p.m. news. But they were there, and if you look at ABC Online, they did cover it. In any event, I think that what, for me, it highlights is that the way we operate, or the way journalism operates, is, you know, within its own internal set of rules, and those rules don't always meet the public, the criteria of public interest, which is really important. And I think that as well, the deployment of the news values such that they are at the moment means that you have a situation where there's a conflict between the public interest, as in the public interest value of a story, and what interests the public, which is what gets a lot of normal lay people confused about what journalism is meant to be about. And you know, it's very easy for if the public broadcasters don't come in and say, well, we are going to cover this story from woe to go because it is in the public interest to do so, then that leaves this wide gap where you've got commercial media saying, well, we'll only cover it when we think it has any interest to our public. So, you know, I think what's called for is a little bit of introspection. I certainly hope there's a bit of introspection happening at the within that particular organisation that covered the story in the way that it did when it became a stenographer for the government. I hope there's introspection happening there, even if behind closed doors and privately, that we may never hear about. But I also hope that news media more generally begins to consider how it covers these big rolling stories that are so financially difficult for them to, you know, to cover.
I know the panellists have started to touch on what next, but my next round of questions to all of you is to ask, well, what does this mean? What do we need to do in future? I'd like to ask you to be a little bit shorter in your answers so that we have an opportunity from our audience to engage with your great expertise. But Ash, just to start with you, you mentioned your work with Lindsay Jackson in building the Not My Debt website, which is also really important in building visibility of the impact, personal impact that Robodebt was having. Based on your experience in Robodebt, what do you see the role of civil society and activists in ensuring that government in future is using automation that is an AI that is ethical and inclusive and accountable?
Okay, so you can't have ethical automation without consent. So Robodebt was intrinsically unethical because it was imposed upon people without asking, you know, how they wished for their affairs to be conducted. And we're seeing this in other realms in government departments where cookie cutter frames are being imposed upon people, whether in DAS or in health departments, where people don't have a lot of control over systems that are occurring and that are affecting their lives. I think the role of civil society here is resistance, really, and understanding that there's a mandate to rule, and if that mandate's breached, then people will fight back. Earlier there was the suggestion that, you know, Alan Tudge had believed that, that he was onto a winner with his marginal electorates. Well, we were, as activists, we decided that we didn't think he was a winner with his marginal electorates and Porter's electorate, which was also marginal. And I think one of the things that we learned was that you have to hang on to hope. You can't assume that governments are all powerful or that media is all powerful. You have to find pockets where, if you wait for the media to be on your side, they never will be. You have to bring them to the table. If you wait for the establishment to come to the table, well, you'll be sitting there a long time and may be very disappointed. And so instead you have to build coalitions. When the Royal Commission happened, we were really lucky. I was in Sydney and I got to meet Thomas Student, who at the time was an activist with the Australian Unemployed Workers Centre and AEW. And I suggested to him that he crowdsource an income and cover the Royal Commission, and Commissioner Holmes called him out at the end of the proceedings and to mark how important his work had been in using social media. And I don't think that we can underestimate the role of social media and these platforms in filling a gap in civil society to ensure that people are included in conversations about what is happening to them, what is happening to society. I mean, the thing that comes across in every campaign that I've run is you don't trust the government. You don't wait for the establishment to fight with you. You wedge them, basically. You essentially say, you either come and work with us or we'll make you into pariahs. You point them on the nose when they don't act in your interest. You find allies. You create solidarity across political lines. And that was one of the interesting things about the campaign. It wasn't a left-right campaign. It was a campaign where basically it was a bottom-up campaign. So it was the people on the ground fighting against government. I think the other important thing is you don't have to win every battle. It's that you just have to not quit. The activists who were there with us, we couldn't have done it without them. And I really think that when you look at automation, you don't see it as after Robodebt. You see that Robodebt carries on into many systems that we're now experiencing. And the fundamental ideologies that backed Robodebt regime are still there and still present. And we need to focus on that as we go forward. Thanks.
As part of the ACOSS and other similar peak bodies, I guess the question I have is what role do you see yourselves playing in ensuring governments use automation responsibly? But I guess another aspect of it is, to what extent do you see the social service sector as needing to build digital literacy? Because sometimes that gap in going, well, we don't exactly know what's happening here, so we don't feel we're actually able to engage. What role do you think, what resources do you think the sector needs also in that space?
I mean, on that question, no question, there needs to be substantial resources available for all layers of civil society to be able to have a voice, exercise some meaningfully at the table with all the skills and expertise that any other more powerful interest brings to bear on these processes, and for governments to recognise that if they say that they have a commitment to human rights, they have a commitment to fairness, they have a commitment to equality, that is not just going to happen. I mean, the sort of the experience that Asha, for example, lays out is absolutely right. You can't sit back and wait. People will mobilise, but let's face it, for some of this work, it needs to be properly resourced outside of government. And I think there are some big questions about us, again, drawing a line in the sand of the way that government has engaged broadly with civil society, things like confidentiality clauses, insisting on, in confidence about data that gets shared, the trade-off you have to give to even get a seat at the table to be working on issues with government. That has to be completely rethought and to open it up properly, and for the adequate resources to be given, particularly to those people on the front line and the grassroots organisations, so that expertise is absolutely front and centre in the design of anything that gets done. And we, as the peak body, we repeatedly said that every time we were in a room. It's not enough to say, oh, we'll open up for a meeting, come along. Because and the Royal Commission laid it out, there were very powerful interest groups all around this process, but some people made a lot of money out of it, actually. And they certainly got a seat at the table. I do, can I just in this sort of what's next? I do also, it's a question that I've wanted to explore further about, how crucial it is for, for people to feel safe and to be able to share what is going on for them, and there is a responsibility on the media, I think, in the way that their conduct either enables people to be intimidated or supports people to participate. And I do think it's very important that gets looked at afresh. I was very struck, Asha, through the process of the as the avalanche of voice people's experience came out, in the December 2016 and then beyond that. One of the things about this nasty program was how far back it went. They stopped, they didn't just go back 6 years, did they? They went back as far as they could go because they wanted the dollars to be as big as they could get them. So, of course, what we know was that many of those people were in jobs. They were, income support had done its job for them. They'd got their, education behind them. They were in a job, and they were no longer feeling like the hand of government was all over them, and they were furious about it, and they felt safe to speak up. Yeah. And so it actually explains what we always say is, let's remember, this is an income support system that, if you look at it in reality, millions of people in any given, period of time will need it. And then, this sort of false dichotomy between the taxpayers over there and the welfare recipients is just rubbish, actually. And so, of course, the intimidatory practices of how you treat people does create a power dynamic. I don't think anybody can step away from that. When you need to feed yourself and you need to feed your kids, you're going to think very carefully about when you stand up and you take on the most powerful, actors in the country through to the Prime Minister, which is really what was happening. And so this thing about resetting the balance and a healthy democracy and a healthy civil society does require resources and an active culture of welcoming the criticism, welcoming the feedback. And I do think the media needs to be thinking about their role in a healthy democracy. Yes, we will always have, I regret it, that we will have parts of the media that understand that the best way you get a click is to have controversy and nasty stuff going on. But, there was a humanitarian aspect to this, which continues to today. Every person that people within the Welfare Rights Network work with, it is often a very, very serious situation that person's facing. The way that we're allowing people to be evicted into homelessness, the way that their income is meeting that they are living in abject poverty in many cases in a very wealthy country. I think that culture which enables people to share that, but for us to bring the government to account for doing things differently is it's an ongoing piece of work. I don't think, I think, you know, none of us here are going to go, oh, great, the job's done. You know, we've got a Royal Commission, it's a blueprint and we can sit back and the government will implement it. We know that that's not the case. And the digitisation systems are rife all across government now, as you know. And so it is so great to have the centre doing its work. I think, as colleagues talked about it, making sure that we are embedding a proper human rights framework around this. We were very clear in saying that when you are making a decision that is adversely going to affect somebody's human right, including income support, there needs to be human involvement and a proper exercise of discretion, and a question about when is that actually the only thing that can be done, because we don't think having payment suspensions as the default that you always use because somebody we think did turn up to appointment. I mean, how did we get here? How did we get here? That is happening today and it's uniformly understood to be the norm. And I mean, we say that, you know, that it needs to be urgently changed, but I'm questioning in the room here, do we get a sense of urgency from the government that they're going to be fixing the automated payment suspensions tomorrow? I think we've got a big piece of work to do. We've got an opportunity with the Workforce Australia inquiry. And I think that if we can all swing behind the Royal Commission findings into that inquiry now, to your point, Asha, beautifully said again, of hope, we're determined to do everything we can to use the Royal Commission to influence the outcome of that Workforce Australia. And to the good politicians that got elected because they want the world to be a better place, to empower them to find their voice inside the caucus and inside the ALP conference and inside the cabinet room to say, we're going to stop it. And we're going to do it really differently. And we're going to go out and we're going to lead the change in the culture of a country, because it is possible. But we're going to need the Prime Minister to say that. We're going to need the Treasurer to say it. We're going to need the Minister for Social Services to say it, and to say it every single day.
Sandra. Sarah, you're working on a project that EJA has been funded to look at the ways in which automation is affecting social security recipients. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're finding from that, but also what do you think is some of the knowledge and skills that your sector, welfare rights lawyers, need to be better equipped to making sure that government technology use is accountable?
Yeah, so this project we see as our next phase of research and advocacy on automation, stemming from Robodebt, but looking beyond Robodebt. Hello, how's that better? Yeah, so this project is the next phase of our advocacy on automation, and we're working with Paul and getting help from some other people in this room on this project. And essentially the focus of it is looking at the impact of automated systems on the vulnerable people who are trying to access and navigate the social security system. So some of the things that we're looking at, for example, are continuities with Robodebt. So as we know, the reason why Robodebt was unlawful was because it reversed the onus of proof. And we're still seeing with debt letters today that they contain very little information, not enough to understand a decision, and let alone, you know, seek appeal. So we're still seeing continuities there. We're also looking at other forms of administrative automated decision-making, like automated suspensions, that is still rife within the system and isn't getting the same kind of engagement as something like Robodebt. And in addition to that, we're also looking at kind of the more banal forms of automation that affect people's access to services. So this is not sophisticated automation, but one thing that's come up over and over again in the course of this project is how difficult it is for people to upload a PDF or take a photo of a PDF through a mobile phone app when they don't have digital literacy, or they don't have phone data, or they don't have a phone. That is, I think, a really key aspect of all of this as well, the access element. And in this first stage of the project, we're only in the first stage, but we've started by interviewing our member centres, legal practitioners and frontline caseworkers on automation issues. And two things are apparent from that. One is that legal practitioners have a tremendous amount of insight on automated decision making and automated systems. The other is that they really don't know that. When I have tried to recruit people to be interviewed, they generally say, oh, you know, I'll talk to you, but I don't think I'll be any help because I don't know anything about automation. But then when you prompt them with like a couple of examples of what you're talking about, then they really, you know, they go on and on and on and on, and they have a lot to say. So I think that speaks to the need to firstly not silo these kinds of discussions about technology away into the realm of AI experts and technology experts, and ensure that these kinds of voices are included because they have a lot that they can say, but also to ensure that the sector is upskilled to the point where they have confidence to engage on these kinds of issues, even though they don't have that specific kind of technical expertise. Because what they do have insight into is how the system actually works. Every day they deal with this very Kafkaesque social security system that's even more impenetrable and opaque because of the use of automation. And they know that automation is an intrinsic aspect of the system itself, and they can speak to the context in which automation is used and the practical implications of that on the people that they serve. And a similar point is that this is such an obvious point, but the key stakeholders of automated systems in social security are social security recipients, and the purpose of Centrelink is to provide a service to people who are vulnerable and disadvantaged, and it shouldn't take a Royal Commission to make that point, but apparently that was needed. So in order to ensure that automated systems are fair and workable for everybody, you need to have co-design with vulnerable people to see how it actually, you know, to have safeguards to ensure that it works for everybody in the system. And of course, when you do that, then you have a more workable system, not just for vulnerable people, but for everybody who engages with all kinds of government systems, because you have worked out those tricky elements in advance. So yeah, I guess the point that I'm making is that Robodebt is not just, it's a lesson in the fact that how intrinsically linked automation is with the policy frameworks and political ideologies that underpin the whole social security system. So as I said already, we don't have a rights-based system. Our approach, in general, government takes a completely overzealous approach to compliance. That's where the resources go. That's where the automated systems operate. They generally focus on compliance. And we have automated systems that punish people and profile people because that's what the system as a whole is designed to do. And we can talk about AI ethics in isolation, but that doesn't really get to the fundamental unfairness of the systems in which they operate. And yeah, so I think our organisations can help to bridge the gap between how social policy manifests on the ground and these broader discourses around technology. And this is a utopian idea, but I think that if there is a human rights focused approach taken to the social security system, we can have a kind of world where automation is used primarily to help people gain access to the system and to assist decision makers, human decision makers, to make fairer decisions. And that's the kind of vision that you know, drives this kind of work and this kind of project.
Thanks, Sasha. Sarah, sorry. Monica, you touched on before about some of the challenges that the media faced in today's world. I guess reflecting on the way in which Robodebt played itself out in the media, what lessons do you think we need to have, or media has, in terms of how do we cover these things of technology, the government use of technology? And I'm going to add in a little question about whistleblowers, because whistleblowers were very important in actually giving some visibility to ASHA and also to the media, these internal people. Where do we sit with that, and where should we be heading in this space? I think it's off again.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, there it is. Okay. With whistleblowers first, I mean, really, it's got it back to government on that one. I mean, the legislation is all over the shop, as we know, and the protections for whistleblowers are so inadequate. And we've seen in the last few years a propensity to have a go and charge the media alongside whistleblowers. So whilst that remains the case, then the possibility of whistleblowers and media, dancing closer together is tenuous. It has to be looked at. Just in terms of the the overall lessons, for me the big lesson out of all this is that public interest journalism is a social good. It has to be recognised as a social good. It has value to society, and without it, government accountability and checks on power just go missing. And it costs money to produce, and investigative journalism in particular costs money to produce. So I think for me the biggest lesson is we need to understand the social value of news. We've never been good at quantifying that. Attempts have been made. We haven't gotten very far. The closest we've come is via the News Media Bargaining Code, which attempted to put a value on news content, and even there, the government said, "Great, we understand that news has value, but somebody else can pay the bill," i.e., the digital platforms. So we've been particularly bad at understanding the real value of news. And the other thing I think for me out of all of this is that you would hope that journalists across the board now get that they have to actually do their job. Their job is not to be a stenographer for the government or for any other lobby group or interest organisation in the country. Their role is to report without fear or favour, in an impartial manner, in a fair and balanced way, and to look after the interests of people who would otherwise be voiceless. And I think that this story is the perfect example of where that occurred. It occurred patchily. It was based, when it did occur, in some sectors of the media, it was based on values that were not altogether in the public interest, and we need to reflect on that.
Thank you very much, Monica. We've got about 20 minutes, and I'm sure there's some great questions happening. So please keep your questions or comments quick so that everyone has an opportunity. So I'm going to hand over and see who I'm at the back's got a roving microphone. So who would like to start? I see, Jake, you've got your hand basically up. So.
Is it on? Hello. Hi, thanks for really fascinating discussion around the topic. I have just a quick question. A few of you have mentioned the potential utility of human rights-based approaches. I'm wondering if you know of any examples in jurisdictions where human rights-based approaches are more available of litigation or action that has produced any sort of meaningful or systemic change in the way welfare operates.
Before we get a response, I'm going to just add on to this, as we've got Ed Santo, who's joining in the panel the second half of today, and we've got Aita Jimenez also talking about human rights, and also Terry Carney talking about administrative law. So we've got a good legal coverage next time, but without cutting that off, Sarah, did you want to respond?
I'll just say something really quickly about that. Is this off again? No, it's on. So we've actually just made a submission about to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights about the need for a Human Rights Act in Australia. Without a Human Rights Act, we don't have the framework to have a human rights focused approach in a lot of ways, because what a Human Rights Act would do is it would apply to all administrative decision making, including all administrative decision making that involves technology and that is made by technology. And we do see that in other jurisdictions. For example, the Dutch debacle around the Siri system, that was a human rights case that was taken, and it was struck down because of privacy and discrimination concern. So it absolutely can be effective in terms of shutting down the system, because the problem in Australia really is that we can only talk about legality, we can talk about lawfulness, but a system can be entirely lawful and it can be transparent, it can be even accurate, but it can also breach people's human rights. So we really do need that lens, and I think that's something that's really what we push as an organisation as well.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I think Asha wanted to say something. Yep.
Just quickly, in terms of comparative responses, I've been looking to the Netherlands in their childcare benefits scandal. You know, they were paid out to the effect of, I think it was thousands, tens of thousands of euros for each person who was affected. Now, when you look at the outcomes of the class action, where people were paid out, more than half of the people who were part of the class action received less than $100, when the average Robodebt is about $2,000. We really have to look at what justice looks like in Australia. You know, saying, oh, we had a Royal Commission, or oh, we had class action. That in itself is not justice. Justice is the feeling inside a person where things are fair, and we haven't achieved that yet. And we really should be looking at, as the questioner brought up, other jurisdictions where they've looked at what justice actually looks like.
Yeah, I might just add, I have consistently said that since the Royal Commission report has come down, that we need to make sure that justice is served, and justice is you know, seen to be served here. And the fact that the Commissioner did not lay out a compensation approach does not mean that should be off the table. I think it's extremely important that we look again at what can be done there, and hopefully there'll be some further discussion about that today. We've also been highlighting the role of private debt collectors, you know, for-profit companies and their involvement in this. And on this issue of the sort of the rights-based protections, I mean, one of the things that was an observation for me actually through the process of the Royal Commission was, understandably, there was a focus on the legality, and it should have been, you know, a focus, but it certainly wasn't, in our view, the fundamental issue, because, you know, if the Parliament had been slightly different and the numbers had looked different, they probably would have legislated it. But because of the absence of basic rights, human rights protections in Australia, just speak to our First Nations communities to be the first to say that's what it looks like when you don't have, you know, basic rights protections that then mean that certain, you know, desires to trample over people, you can't just use legislation to cover your back, and that there is a place for people to go when that kind of legislation gets put through, to strike it down, and for people to have reparations. That is a norm in some other countries, and we are an absolute outsider when it comes to our absence of human rights-based protections in Australia. And so make a submission, and even if it's late, find your voice, because we need, again, a further push to make sure we've got a Human Rights Act which actually has some teeth in it and includes economic and social rights, may I say. Thanks.
Got no question down here.
Oh, hi. My name is Justine Humphrey. I'm a senior lecturer here at the University of Sydney, and I've done a lot of work on homelessness and the impact of social welfare systems and digital automation on marginalised communities. One concern I have is, and first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge it's fantastic to hear from the panellists and acknowledge the hard work and incredible persistence of all of the people over 7 years now, working towards more just outcomes for people who have been caught up in this and other welfare system debacles. But one concern I have about framing this in terms of a failure, and look, I'm a culprit in doing that myself, thinking about Robodebt as a failure, is that it takes away from an understanding and a response to recognising that in some ways Robodebt was a very successful extension of a disciplinary welfare system, and that if we think about it that way, in that light, we can start to ask questions which are very relevant for the ADM+S about what is the purpose of digital automation in government, who gets to define that purpose, who gets to be part of the implementation and assessment of the benefits of digital transformation. And this goes well beyond automation, which is actually just one strand of digital transformation. And so I think there's a much bigger story here and a much bigger lesson, or maybe a different lesson, that we can learn and tackle, engage with, if we think about the purpose of digital automation within welfare systems and their role as underpinning particular regimes of welfare that is not just about the culture but also the economics of welfare based on a kind of scarcity model.
Before I get the panels to respond, can I get this Scarlett, because Scarlett works in a similar kind of area, so maybe your question might be fairly similar, or comment?
Sorry, I missed the last bit of that, Paul.
Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, just a quick comment and then a question. The first comment, and I want to say thank you to everyone here. My name's Scarlett Wilcock. I've been working not on Robodebt but other things, and so it's wonderful to have this moment and to recognise some of all the hard work of people here and not here. And I guess that's the comment I want to make that really came through from the people here, is that this was won by a campaign and with many people, and of course key people, including Asha. And I just wanted to sort of recognise or put some hesitance in just instituting a human rights framework. Maybe that's an excellent rallying point, but people still need to fight. And so that would be an excellent tool, perhaps. But instituting something like that alone, if Robodebt has taught us anything, will do nothing if it's just, if Robodebt was illegal, and yet here we are, right? So many years later, and people had to fight. And so I guess that's one thing, is that, and that's a good reminder for all the lawyers in the room, which I am one of them, that it's, lawyers can be helpful, but we are tools also, perhaps in both senses of that term. And the other question, the other thing that came across really strongly is that the way that we, what we can do is to really amplify and strengthen our democratic institutions that are, in some ways, have withered, and to amplify the voices of those people that are most affected as the centre of the resistance of the stories and their work is what has made this happen. And we're mostly academics here. What could academics do, I guess, or what ways in which we could work differently or better, including in the centre here, to work on some of those things around automation? Of course, we are part of this, or many of us are part of this centre. If anyone has any thoughts on that, I'd be really keen to hear them.
Is there any comment, response from the panel to the last two comments, questions? Asha?
So Justin Warren, who's a technology consultant who is very involved in the campaign against Robodebt, he FOI'd a vast number of documents to do with Robodebt. And one thing he liked to say a lot on social media was the purpose of the system is what it does. So it doesn't matter if you say, oh, it's to make sure that it's correct, the payments, or it's for justice. But if the purpose, if the actual thing that a system does is takes money off welfare recipients, well, that's its purpose, is to steal money off welfare recipients. I think we don't need to over-intellectualize to some degree what these systems do. It's what they do, and we see it, and we can start fighting it from there.
Thank you. Any other comments, reactions? Here, and then I'm going to check to see if there's any questions on Zoom at all.
Thank you very much, everyone. Just really great panel. This is Pia. I think that one of the key things that's also come through is that the public sector has been weaponised. And right now I know there's consultation around, like, it's never had actually a purpose statement. You go to most public services around the world and there is a clear, what is the purpose of the public sector? And I know there's consultation happening right now about what the purpose statement of the public sector should be in Australia. I guess I'd love to hear from this panel what you think the purpose of the public sector could be to provide a bit of a, let's call it a resistance or a counterbalance to political purpose.
I'm happy to kick off, and I think the notion of the public interest and to act in the public interest is pretty core and fundamental. And part of that is about, of course, all the basics of ethics and avoiding conflicts of interest, and there's a bundle of frameworks that could be brought around that in terms of your conduct. But it's also to recognise the extraordinary power that government holds, and for there to be an active obligation on it to use its power to reset power in society, because there are very wealthy country, very wealthy interest groups, very wealthy influence that mean that we still have the tax settings that we have. Wealthiest country in the world, we're still the 10th lowest when it comes to our overall tax base, because every time somebody pops up to talk about maybe we need to raise some more revenue for something that is in the public interest, the sort of wealthy interest groups get a seat at the table. And I think to be very explicit that one of the core purposes of the public service is to reset the equity issues and the power balance in society, and to actively do that. That it actually needs to redesign itself to ensure that it is actively preferencing giving a seat at the table for people who are on the lowest incomes before they give a seat at the table to people on the highest incomes, because people on really high incomes, they're going to get in there one way or the other. When it comes to setting policy, we need to have right across all parts of government that kind of lens about equity and the economic and social rights to be embedded within it. We've got, for example, a huge energy transition underway, and I can tell you the money involved in that is everywhere. Very powerful interest groups are everywhere, but try and get even a little bit of resources for civil society groups who represent people who are sitting in the hot boxes to be in all of those rooms. Well, it ain't happening right now. And so where is the voice of the public service to say we must have that mechanism, civil society participation, people on low incomes, front and centre in our work in order for us to do our job. So that would be, for me, a really critical shift in terms of the activation of the public service in the public interest. Thanks.
Thanks, Cassandra. Anyone else would like to say something about what the public service should be?
Thanks. We also need to actually have a public service. We need to have the people at the lower rungs need to be trained, they need to be supported, they need to have the tools to be able to raise issues, and in speaking of the purpose of a system like this, automation really falls into that nicely as a tool for like an insidious welfare state, because it's a way to cut costs, it's a way to contract out, and it's a way to not invest in people in the system. And I think that is a really key element of all of this, is that there are people that really care in the public service. They're often not able to raise these kinds of issues because they've been sidelined through the use of automation and through contracting out to private sector.
Thanks, Sarah. Did you want to comment? Okay. Any other questions from the audience? And this will be our last question, so thank you very much.
Yeah, just to build on what Sarah was just saying, I'm from EJA too. because of the sort of insidious and creeping nature of automation and digitisation in Services Australia Centrelink, often those public servants that are really on the side of good have no idea what's going on. They're unable to explain a decision. And Cass was mentioning the tens of thousands of people constantly who are having their payments suspended. And those suspensions are the result of step-by-step automation in the system that we hardly understand ourselves. And it starts off with the job seeker classification instrument and the application of an algorithm. And it's really, really complicated. And that's why it is so essential that we look at primarily look at the ongoing impacts of robodebt on affected people, make sure that this doesn't happen again in respect of compliance and debt activity, but there's also the broader issue of compliance with requirements in order to maintain your social security entitlements, and the people most affected are the people who are most vulnerable. They're the most likely people to have suspension imposed on them. And we don't quite understand how that occurs because there are so many steps in the process. And there's no way those individuals understand how that has occurred. And when they're giving up really personal information as part of the job seeker classification instrument in order to be sorted as to whether they'll be digital or whether they'll be referred to Workforce Australia, they have no idea why they're giving that information up and what that information will be used for. They think that that information will be used to help them, but primarily it's to sort them and for cost cutting to work out which people can just be dealt with digitally. And I think we've gone full circle to what Asha articulated so clearly, the very need that affected people be at the centre of all of this, because it's the most vulnerable people now that they're incurring debts, but they're also dropping off income support, particularly very, very vulnerable people. And the prime example, of course, is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in remote communities, increasingly disengaged because they can't engage with the system.
Thank you very much. And I think that just drawing to close, one of the things that comes through for me very much is just like you said, robodebt isn't just a one-off. It's part of really an outburst of a whole lot of structural different elements that, like the ongoing technologicalisation of public service, a grinding down or politicisation of the public service, the changes of the capacity of the media to respond to these things, but also at the same time, the work that Asha did is showing the visibility of social media, which we wouldn't have had 20 years ago. So there's a whole these structural changes, and that gives us a lot of work to do, but it also potentially gives us opportunities to say what we can do differently. So with that in mind, I'd really like everyone to join thanks to our wonderful panellists, Monica, Sarah, Asha and Cassandra. Thank you very much for coming today and sharing all of what you said.
If I may, my colleague Charmaine Crowe is on leave at the moment. Just want to particularly also send best wishes from Charmaine, who was in the Robodebt process from the very beginning and worked so hard alongside all of you. And she's with us in spirit, rest assured. She's hanging off a mountain at the moment, I think. Thank you. Thanks.